Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good morning. I'm Meredith Ringel-Morris from Microsoft Research, and I'm giving you a short talk about the accessibility of crowd work to people with disabilities. And I particularly want to acknowledge my co-author, Kate Zyskowski, who was an intern at Microsoft last year. So digital labor is becoming an increasingly important form of labor in the modern era. And microtasking, of which Amazon Mechanical Turk is probably the most familiar example, is becoming an increasingly important category of digital labor. However, this is still a very unregulated category of labor. So of course, there has been a lot of talk about the lack of benefits or fair wages on these platforms. And it's also the case that currently these platforms don't need to comply with various labor laws. For example, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which among other things requires that employers provide reasonable accommodations to make sure that people with varying disabilities have fair access to employment. And if one of the goals of us in thinking about these platforms is to think about how digital labor can evolve to be a fair and just form and meaningful form of employment, it's important to think about whether that form of employment is accessible for participation by everybody. There have been several studies looking at the demographics of who currently participates as workers in various microtasking platforms such as Mechanical Turk. And these have found things that, for example, there are many more female workers than male workers. They tend to be on the less educated end of the spectrum. There's increasing participation from places such as India. But none of these demographies have looked into whether the participants on these platforms are disabled in any fashion. And so we set out to understand whether people with disabilities have access to this form of digital labor, whether they're interested in participating in this form of digital labor, and whether those who have been trying to participate are able to do so successfully, or if not, how should platforms be redesigned to better support inclusion? So we conducted a series of both interviews and surveys with people with Americans with a wide variety of sensory, physical, and cognitive disabilities. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of our findings. So one thing that surprised me was that I found that thinking about accessibility in reference to microtasking was much more nuanced than I first thought. So when I think about the accessibility of software, the first thing that usually comes to mind is what I'll call here level 1 accessibility. So the basic accessibility of the user interface. And of course, this was a problem that many of our interviewees and survey respondents discussed. So for example, someone who was blind tried to register for an account on Mechanical Turk, and it required completing a CAPTCHA to prove that they weren't a bot. But of course, CAPTCHAs can be very difficult. To complete audio CAPTCHAs that they have for blind people are actually much harder to complete than visual CAPTCHAs, and so it was hard for them just to make an account on the system. There's also the sort of basic accessibility problem that the platform isn't the only place where people interact. So even if the platform itself is accessible, Mechanical Turk is always redirecting you to different third-party sites that the individual requesters create, and those third-party sites have a very wide variety of interfaces, a very wide variety of compliance with different regulations and suggestions for being accessible, and so this is a very challenging level of accessibility for many workers. But then, from talking to people, it became clear that there's a second, deeper level of accessibility problem. And that's around the fundamental way that workflows in microtasking are structured. So for example, it's very difficult for workers to identify what tasks that they should choose to get started working, because the metadata for different tasks doesn't necessarily specify what kinds of abilities might be required. For example, you might select a survey task, and perhaps you have a vision impairment, and most of the questions are textual, and so they work through a screen reader, but then you get to a question that requires looking at imagery, and suddenly you have to abandon the task partway through, even though you've already invested time in it. Then there's the problem that you have to do, again, using a lot of third-party sites and switching back and forth between different applications, which can be very complicated. And timing is fundamentally built into the workflow of many of these platforms, partly to try to weed out bad workers who are spamming the system by accepting tasks and never finishing them. But many people with different disabilities require perhaps slightly more time to complete a task, not because they're a scammer, but perhaps you're dyslexic and it's slower for you to read things. And there's no flexibility typically to those time limits built into the workflows of microtasking. And finally, there was a third level of accessibility challenge, which was more fundamentally about the accessibility of new types of job experiences. For example, just learning about the existence of this type of work, which was, for the people we interviewed who were disabled, who participated in microtasking, it was actually highly valued to them as a type of work because of the flexible hours. They were able to work from home. They didn't necessarily have to reveal their disability status to anyone if they didn't choose to do so. And yet it was very difficult for them to learn about crowd work. So right now, people who know about things like TaskRabbit are often in the technorati or in kind of a hip in circle. And so how do we disseminate that information? Also, the accessibility of the job experience in terms of being promoted and not just doing the basic, more menial tasks. But so, as our speaker mentioned, you have to earn reputation within the system to rise up the ladder and get access to the more interesting and high-quality jobs. But because of the problems with the workflow, many of these participants weren't able to earn reputation or earn it as quickly. For example, if they had to abandon tasks because of the time limits or they weren't well described, they would often, their reputation points on the system would suffer, even though they weren't necessarily scammers. There was no good way for them to adjudicate the process of managing their reputation to advance through the system. So I don't have time to talk right now about this, but during lunch I'd be happy to talk with anyone who's interested about what does this mean for platform operators, for job requesters. How should we restructure platforms to be more inclusive of people with disabilities? Thank you.
So hang on one second.